first sign that something was wrong was not the wind. It was the silence inside the hill. Caleb Mercer stood in the dim underground stable with one hand on a lantern and one hand on the neck of an old sorrel gelding that would not stop trembling. Above them, the storm was already clawing across the Wyoming prairie, hammering the frozen ground with such force that dust and snow shook loose from the timber braces overhead. Yet down in the buried barn, the air stayed still, warm enough to breathe. Warm enough for the horses to stop steaming after a few minutes, warm enough to feel almost unnatural while the world outside turned savage. That was when Caleb heard it, not from his own animals, from far off through the earth and wind, a strange, thin sound. Horses screaming somewhere out in the white dark. He lifted his head and listened harder. Someone else's barn was failing, someone else's herd was freezing, and the men who had laughed at his father for digging a stable into a hillside were about to learn why an old rancher had trusted dirt more than steel. The only question now was whether they would learn it in time. 10 miles north of Dry Creek, men were losing that race already. The storm had not arrived like an ordinary winter storm. It had fallen out of the sky in one hard, violent turn. At noon, the temperature had still been above freezing. By mid-afternoon, the water trough beside Caleb's house had skinned over with ice thick enough to hold a hammer blow. By sunset, the whole ranch looked dipped in glass. Fence wire rang in the wind like a tuning fork. The well pump groaned. The cottonwoods along the creek stood black and motionless for one eerie hour, then bent so hard in the first gust that Caleb thought they would snap in half. His father, Amos Mercer, had seen it coming 3 days earlier. Amos was 71 and moved slow even on a good day, but his mind still tracked weather like a man reading tracks in mud. He had watched the sky go yellow over the northwest ridge. He had watched geese cut south in a low, crooked line. He had watched the cattle bunch against the lee side of the draw before the first hard wind ever came. Then he had told Caleb to stop wasting daylight and start bedding down the buried barn for a full lock-in. People in Dry Creek called it the mole hole. They had called it worse before that. For half a year, they had watched Amos and Caleb carve into the south face of a long grassy rise behind the house. Men at the feed store said the old man had gone soft in the head after his wife died. Women in town said grief had made him reckless. The richest horse breeder in the county, Wade Gannon, called it poor man foolishness built out of fear. He had just finished a bright new metal stable on his own spread. It had wide electric doors, fans, heaters, water lines wrapped in insulation, and smooth sheeted walls that flashed silver in the sun. When Wade spoke about it, he sounded like a banker showing off a city tower. When he spoke about Amos's buried barn, he smiled the way a man smiles at a child building a fort from scrap wood. Amos never argued much. He just kept digging. The work had started in spring when the ground first softened. Caleb had hired a neighbor with an excavator to cut a deep trench into the hill. Then he and Amos lined the sides with salvaged concrete panels from an old grain facility 3 counties over. They welded steel cross braces, set heavy cedar posts, built drainage tile behind the walls, packed gravel under the floor, laid a center trench for runoff and manure wash. Then they roofed the whole thing with reclaimed bridge beams, thick plank decking, waterproof membrane, and nearly 4 feet of packed soil returned over the top. From the road, when the grass came back, the stable all but vanished. Only the thick timber-framed entrance and a row of vent stacks poking from the hillside gave it away. Amos said the earth was a blanket if you respected it and a grave if you did not. He had learned that from his own father, who had been born in a sod dugout and never trusted winter mercy. As a boy, Amos had heard stories about root cellars that stayed above freezing in terrible cold, spring houses that held their temperature when the air outside changed by 40 degrees in a day, and old stock shelters banked into hillsides so cattle could stand out of the wind and live through nights that killed the careless. He read county histories, asked old ranchers questions, sketched layouts on feed sacks. Then he built not a romantic memory, but a working horse barn designed around one plain truth. 6 feet down, the land changed slowly even when the sky did not. He also knew horses died fast in the wrong kind of modern barn. People liked to think cold killed them by itself. That was not the full story. Sudden swings, wet coats, frozen water, panic, bad footing, sharp drafts, failed power, and metal turning every breath into ice on the walls were what broke a herd apart. Horses trapped in noise and fear could burn themselves down before morning. So Amos built for quiet first. Inside the hill barn, sound was different. Hooves did not ring and echo. Wind did not rattle sheet metal. The air came in through long buried intake pipes that tempered it before it reached the stalls. Warm damp air drifted out higher vents near the back arch. Nothing needed electricity to keep breathing. Nothing needed a furnace to stay above danger. When Caleb had asked why he was so sure it would matter, Amos only said, "Because men build for comfort now, not for failure." That sentence came back to Caleb as the storm deepened. By dusk, all 12 of their horses were inside. Old June, the pregnant bay mare, kept nosing the straw and pouring in a tight circle. Ranger, the youngest gelding, fought the dark entrance until Amos took his halter himself and led him by voice alone. The lantern light made the white of the horses' eyes shine, but once they settled fully. Heads dropped. Hay rustled. Breath slowed. The wall thermometer held at 51 degrees. Outside, the yard was disappearing. Caleb went up twice to check the vent caps and the outer doors. Each time the cold hit harder. By the second trip, it felt less like air and more like broken glass scraping the lungs. Snow moved sideways, not down. He could barely see the chicken shed from the house porch. The world had narrowed to whatever stood within 20 feet of his boots. He slammed the stable door the second time and dropped the crossbar into place. Amos was by the tool bench with the battery radio pressed to one ear. Static, then a weather alert, then a deputy somewhere south saying roads were gone and power was dropping line by line across the county. Amos turned the volume down and sat very still. "You thinking about Wade?" Caleb said. Amos did not answer at once. He looked toward the back of the stable where the horses stood warm in the earth-dark quiet. "Wade had 43 head in that new place," he said at last. "Fine blood, high feed bills, fancy paperwork, and a roof that sings like a skillet when hail hits it. If his generator goes down, that whole barn turns into a freezer." Caleb set his lantern on a peg. He tried not to picture it, but he did anyway. Long metal walls, concrete floor, wet heat turning to ice, horses slipping. Pipes bursting, animals kicking at panels and cutting themselves open in panic. Then, as if the thought itself had called it, the radio spat to life. The voice came in broken under wind and static, but Caleb knew it at once. Wade Gannon, proud voice, cracked thin now. "Mayday from Gannon Ridge," he said. "Generator fail. Heat gone, roof drifting heavy on the west span. We need help if anybody can hear this." Caleb looked at his father. For one moment Amos Mercer did not move. This was the man who had laughed in his face at the stockman's supper. The man who had offered to buy their place cheap before the burial work bankrupted them. The man who had called the hill barn a casket for horses and the end of a stubborn old fool. The radio hissed again. "Please," Wade said, and there was no pride left in him now. "We are losing them." Amos rose slowly from the bench. His knees popped. He reached for his coat hanging on the peg by the door. When he spoke, his voice was flat and tired and firm all at once. "Get the tow chains," he said. "Wake the diesel tractor, and bring the blindfold cloths. If we go now." Caleb stared at him. In this storm, leaving the hill barn meant walking out into near certain death. Even a tractor could vanish in a drift. Even a strong horse could go down and never get up again. June kicked once in her stall behind them. The radio crackled. The wind above gave a long, low moan through the buried vents. Amos pulled on his gloves and looked at the steel door that held the blizzard back. "The men who mocked us are about to send their horses into the dark," he said. "Let us see whether we can bring any of them home." The storm did not look like weather anymore. It looked like a wall. Caleb had seen bad winters before, but nothing like the white violence that rolled across the prairie that night. When he stepped out of the underground barn behind his father, the wind slammed into him so hard it shoved him sideways. The lantern light died instantly, swallowed by spinning snow that moved like sand in a desert storm. For a moment he could not even tell where the ground ended and the sky began. Amos leaned close and shouted through the wind, "Keep low and follow the shed wall. The tractor is inside." Caleb nodded and pushed forward. The equipment shed was attached to the buried barn by a short covered tunnel that Amos had built as an afterthought months earlier. At the time it seemed unnecessary. Now it was the only reason the tractor was reachable at all. Snow was already piled halfway up the outer door. Caleb forced it open with both shoulders. Inside the shed, the noise of the storm dropped to a dull roar. The old tractor sat where they had left it, paint faded and chipped, but solid as a rock. Amos called it the mule. It was older than Caleb himself, built in a time when engines were simple and iron was thick. Amos climbed into the cab with slow, careful movements. Caleb grabbed the ether can and sprayed the intake while Amos worked the choke. "Ready," he shouted. Amos nodded and turned the key. The starter groaned once, twice. The third time, the engine caught with a violent cough, throwing black smoke against the shed roof. The tractor settled into a rough diesel rumble that vibrated through the floor. "Good girl," Amos muttered, patting the steering wheel. Caleb climbed into the cab beside him. The seat felt like frozen stone, even through heavy clothes. The windows fogged instantly from their breath. Amos pushed the door open and drove straight into the storm. The moment they left the shed, the world disappeared. The headlights reflected off the swirling snow and created a solid white curtain. Amos reached up and shut them off. "Drive by the fence line," he said. "Light just blinds you in this mess." Caleb leaned half out of the side door so he could see the ground. The wind tore at his coat and burned his face raw. He squinted into the dark gray storm and searched for the faint shadow of fence posts. Post, drift, post, drift. They crawled forward at walking speed. Snow hammered the windshield so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel. The tractor wheels chewed through drifts that climbed halfway up the tires. 3 miles to Wade Gannon's ranch usually took 6 minutes. That night it took nearly an hour. Halfway there, the tractor slid suddenly to the left. The front tire dropped into the roadside ditch, and the whole machine tipped at a sickening angle. Caleb grabbed the dash. "Easy, easy." Amos slammed the differential lock with his boot and twisted the wheel hard to the right. The tires spun wildly for a moment, throwing snow and mud behind them. Then the tread caught frozen earth beneath the drift. Slowly, painfully, the tractor clawed its way back onto the road. Caleb exhaled for the first time in nearly a minute. Amos wiped frost from his mustache. "Can't rush winter," he said quietly. "She always wins that race." They pushed on. Finally, a shape appeared through the storm ahead. At first, Caleb thought it was a hill. Then lightning flashed somewhere inside the cloud bank, and he saw the metal roof. Wade Gannon's stable. Even through the storm, the building looked wrong. Snow had drifted against the walls almost to the eaves. The wind slammed into the broad metal sides and turned the entire structure into a giant drum. The sound of the horses inside reached them even before the door. It was not normal noise. It was panic. Amos killed the engine and stepped down from the tractor. The wind nearly ripped the door from Caleb's hand as they forced their way inside. The temperature inside the barn shocked him. It was barely warmer than outside. The metal roof had turned into a sheet of ice. Long frozen spikes hung from the beams like teeth. Every gust of wind shook the building and sent shards of ice raining down on the terrified animals below. 40 horses filled the stalls. Steam poured off their bodies. Their hooves slipped across the frozen concrete floor. Some kicked wildly against the metal walls. Others stood trembling so hard their entire bodies shook. Wade Gannon stumbled toward them with a flashlight. The rich rancher looked nothing like the confident man Caleb remembered. His expensive coat was ripped, and his hair was frozen into stiff white spikes. "The generator is dead," Wade shouted. Pipes burst. Water froze solid an hour ago. A loud crack echoed overhead. Caleb looked up. One of the aluminium trusses had bent under the weight of the snow drifting across the roof. The entire center span sagged. Amos stared at it for 2 seconds, then he spoke with calm, final certainty. "This roof won't last the night." Wade's face went pale. "What do we do?" Amos turned slowly and looked across the herd. 40 horses, panicked, cold, standing on ice. "We move them," he said. "Move them where?" "To the hill barn." Wade laughed weakly. 3 miles in this storm. They'll freeze before we get halfway." Amos shook his head. "They'll die in here if we stay." Another loud pop sounded from the roof beams. That ended the argument. Amos began issuing orders with the voice of a man who had worked livestock his entire life. "Get every rope you have," he said. "Halters, lead lines, chains, everything." Caleb moved immediately, running from stall to stall gathering tack. Within minutes, the barn floor was covered with ropes. Amos grabbed the halter of Wade's prized stallion, Midnight Prince. The massive black horse snorted and reared, eyes rolling white with terror. Amos wrapped a piece of flannel around the animal's eyes and tied it gently behind the ears. "Blindfold him," Amos said. "He'll follow the pull if he can't see the storm." He clipped the lead rope to the tractor tow hook outside the door. Then he began tying the other horses one by one. Each horse's halter clipped to the tail strap of the one ahead. A living chain, head to tail, 39 behind the stallion. Wade stared at the line of animals stretching across the barn. "I've never seen anything like this." "Old trail method," Amos said. "Freight mules used to cross mountains like this." Caleb checked the knots twice. The horses stamped and blew steam, but the line held steady. Outside, the wind screamed louder. Snow pushed through the half-open door in waves. Amos climbed back into the tractor seat. Caleb grabbed the rope beside the lead horse. Wade walked along the side of the line, shouting softly to keep the animals moving. The door swung open. The storm rushed inside like a living thing. Amos engaged the gears. The tractor pulled forward. The stallion stepped out first. One by one, the rest of the horses followed into the white darkness. The line stretched behind the tractor like a living river, 40 horses tied together, moving blindly through the worst blizzard the valley had seen in 50 years. Caleb glanced back once. The metal barn groaned behind them. Then the wind swallowed it completely, and ahead, somewhere through the blinding storm, the underground barn waited inside the hill. If the tractor made it, if the horses did not panic, if the storm did not bury them alive first. The line of horses moved through the storm like a slow-breathing animal. At the front, the old diesel tractor crawled forward with its engine knocking and roaring, the sound half swallowed by the wind. Snow hammered against the metal hood and packed into the wheel wells. Behind the tractor, Midnight Prince followed with the blindfold tight across his eyes, trusting the pull of the rope more than the world he could not see. Behind him came 39 more horses, head to tail, lead rope clipped to halter, a living chain stretching into the white dark. Caleb walked near the front beside the stallion. He could barely see Amos through the side window of the tractor cab. The snow blasted sideways so hard that even breathing felt like inhaling broken glass. Wade Gannon stayed farther back along the line, moving from horse to horse, shouting encouragement and yanking animals forward when they slowed. "Keep moving," he yelled. "Do not stop. Just keep moving." The road had disappeared already. Fence posts were the only guide. Every 20 or 30 feet, Caleb searched the blowing snow for the faint black tip of wood sticking out of the ground. When he saw one, he shouted and pointed for Amos to keep the tractor lined up with it. Post, drift to post. The storm erased everything else. Snow built against Caleb's boots until every step felt like wading through wet cement. Twice he stumbled and nearly lost the rope in his hand. The stallion pulled steady, head low against the wind, muscles bunching beneath the ice forming on his mane. The first mile took nearly half an hour. The second mile was worse. The temperature had fallen so low that the diesel fuel in the tractor was beginning to thicken. The engine started missing beats. Chug, knock, chug. Each time the sound changed, Caleb felt his stomach tighten. If the tractor died, the entire line would stop. And if the horses stopped in this cold for more than a few minutes, they would begin to fail. Halfway across Miller's Creek Bridge, the disaster came. The narrow wooden span had drifted almost level with the snowbanks on each side. The tractor rolled onto it slowly, the heavy tires grinding over ice. Midnight Prince followed. The next 3 horses crossed without trouble. Then the 6th horse slipped. His rear legs shot out sideways. The gelding crashed hard against the bridge railing and slid half through the gap between the posts. His body twisted, one hind leg hanging over the frozen creek below. The rope snapped tight along the entire line. The horses behind slammed into each other. Several reared. One began kicking wildly. "Stop," Wade shouted. Amos slammed the tractor brakes. The line jerked to a halt. The fallen horse screamed, choking as the halter rope tightened around his throat. If the line held, the horse would strangle. If the rope snapped, the entire herd behind might bolt. Caleb ran forward. The horse thrashed helplessly against the railing, eyes wide with terror. "Cut the rope," Wade yelled, fumbling for a knife. "He is pulling the others down." Amos jumped down from the tractor and grabbed Wade's wrist before the blade touched the line. No cutting. The horse was already half over the edge. "We cannot lift 1,000 pounds by hand," Wade shouted. Amos looked once at the tangled ropes, then at the tractor, then at the fallen horse. "Unhook the line behind him," he said. Wade hesitated. "Do it." Wade unclipped the ropes connecting the rest of the herd. Now they stood loose, but bunched together in the storm, blowing steam into the dark. Amos ran back to the tractor toolbox and pulled out a wide cargo strap. He slipped it under the horse's chest and belly, looping it around the animal's ribs. Then he hooked the other end to the front loader bucket. "Stand back," he shouted. The hydraulic lift groaned as Amos raised the bucket. The strap tightened. The horse's body lifted slowly. Instead of hanging by his neck, the strap carried his weight under the chest. The gelding scrambled with his front legs. Hooves scraped across the wooden planks. Another inch. Another. Then suddenly the horse slid back onto the bridge floor in a spray of ice. The animal staggered to its feet, shaking violently but alive. Caleb grabbed the halter and steadied him. Wade reconnected the rope chain behind the horse with trembling fingers. For a moment nobody spoke. The storm howled around them. Then Amos climbed back into the tractor. "We move," he said simply. The herd crossed the bridge one by one. No horse slipped again. The final mile felt endless. The tractor engine was struggling badly now. The thickening fuel made it cough and shudder with every rotation. Caleb could see the dark outline of the Mercer Hill ahead through the storm. "Almost home," he shouted back along the line. Wade repeated the words farther down the herd. "Almost home." The phrase passed from man to horse like a prayer. But winter had one more test waiting. Just 50 yards from the underground barn, the engine died. It did not sputter or fade. It seized. A metallic scream tore through the cab as the pistons locked solid. The tractor rolled another few feet and stopped. The sudden silence was terrifying. Without the engine noise, the full roar of the storm rushed in. Caleb felt the wind claw at his coat like hands trying to tear it away. Amos climbed down stiffly from the cab. "That is as far as she goes." The underground barn entrance stood only a short distance away, half hidden by drifting snow, but the horses had to walk the rest of the way. Caleb grabbed the stallion's rope. "Come on, boy." The stallion lowered his head and stepped forward. The herd followed slowly behind. At that moment, Amos noticed something on the hill above the entrance. A figure, someone moving weakly with a shovel. The person staggered once, then collapsed into the snow. "Leo," Amos breathed. The young ranch hand had been clearing the air intake vents above the buried barn. Without them, the underground stable would slowly fill with stale air. The boy had fought the storm alone. Now he lay half buried beside the pipe. Caleb dragged the stallion forward toward the barn entrance. Amos climbed the hill through the wind. Each step was a battle. He reached the boy and rolled him over. Leo's face was pale and crusted with ice. His lips moved weakly. Did the air clear? Amos lifted the boy over his shoulder and carried him down the slope. Below them, the horses were already surging toward the open stable doors, pulled by the smell of warmth and hay. They poured inside the earth tunnel like water rushing into a cave. 40 animals pushing shoulder to shoulder. Caleb grabbed the last halter rope and dragged the final horse inside. Amos stumbled through the entrance with Leo in his arms. "Close the door," Wade shouted. Amos slammed the heavy steel door shut. The wind struck it like a hammer. For a moment the hinges groaned, then the seal caught. The roar of the storm faded instantly. Inside the underground barn, the air was warm and still. Horses filled every inch of space. 52 animals packed tightly together. Steam rose from their bodies like fog. The thermometer climbed. 52 degrees, 55, 58. The underground barn had become a furnace. Amos lowered Leo onto a pile of blankets. The boy coughed weakly. "Air is moving again," he whispered. Amos looked up at the ceiling where the ventilation pipes hummed softly with steady airflow. "Yes, son," the barn breathed. The storm raged 3 feet above their heads, but down inside the hill, the animals were alive. All of them, for now. For the first few minutes after the door sealed shut, no one spoke. The silence inside the hill felt almost unreal after the roar of the storm. 52 horses stood packed shoulder to shoulder through the curved tunnel of the underground barn. Their breath rose in thick white clouds that drifted slowly toward the ventilation shafts above. The thermometer on the support beam climbed one small line at a time. 58 degrees, 60, 62. Caleb leaned against the wall, chest heaving, trying to get feeling back into his hands. His gloves were stiff with ice. His beard had frozen into small white spikes. Across the barn, Wade Gannon moved through the herd slowly, touching necks and checking legs. The rich rancher who once wore polished boots now walked through straw and mud like any hired hand. One of the mares stamped nervously, but the horses were calming now. The thick earth walls swallowed the noise of the storm outside. The air felt steady, safe. Amos knelt beside Leo. The young man lay wrapped in blankets near the warmest corner between 2 large mares. His face had lost its gray color, but he still shivered hard. Amos poured a small cup of hot coffee from a thermos and held it to the boy's lips. "Slow now," he said, "small sips." Leo swallowed carefully. Thought I was going to sleep out there," he murmured. You almost did, Amos replied. Leo looked around the barn with wide eyes. He cleared the intake pipe, but the snow kept drifting back over it. I had to dig 3 times. Amos nodded. You saved everyone in here doing that. Leo's gaze moved slowly across the crowded tunnel. He had never seen so many horses in one place. They stood packed flank to flank, their bodies pressing warmth into the air. The combined heat of 50 animals turned the underground chamber into a steady living furnace. The smell of hay, leather, and horse sweat filled the space. It was the smell of life. But the danger was not finished. Caleb noticed it first. He walked toward the thermometer and frowned. The mercury kept rising, 64 degrees, then 66. He looked at Amos. We are going to overheat this place. Amos followed his eyes to the vent pipes. With 12 horses, the ventilation system balanced perfectly, but with 52 animals breathing and generating heat, the airflow needed adjustment. Open the upper vents, Amos said. Caleb climbed onto a feed crate and pulled the metal lever that opened the high exhaust pipes along the back wall. Immediately, the airflow changed. Warm, humid air drifted upward and out through the shafts. Fresh, cooler air slipped in through the intake tubes buried beneath the hill. The thermometer steadied. 68 degrees. That will hold, Amos said quietly. Across the barn, Wade had stopped beside a familiar stall. The pregnant mare June lay in the straw. Her breathing was deep and uneven. Caleb walked over and froze. Her water had broken. Not tonight, he whispered. But the mare had already begun pushing. Wade crouched beside her. Is something wrong? Foal coming, Caleb said. In this crowd. Amos moved quickly. He pushed several horses aside to clear space around the mare. The animals shifted reluctantly but obeyed the firm pressure of his hands. The barn was packed so tightly that the birthing area barely fit between 2 stall dividers. Leo struggled to sit up. I can help. You rest, Amos said, but the boy was already sliding off the blankets. No, you are needed with the horses. Amos studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Fine, wash your hands in that bucket and get over here. Leo obeyed instantly. The lantern light flickered across the straw as June pushed again, her muscles strained, her sides trembled. Caleb knelt beside the mare's shoulder, stroking her neck. Easy, girl, easy. The first sign appeared, 2 small hooves inside a clear blue sack. Good, Amos said quietly, front feet first. The mare groaned and pushed again. The nose appeared. Leo grabbed a clean cloth and wiped mucus from the foal's nostrils. Another push. The small body slid free into the straw. For a second, the foal did not move. Leo broke the sack and cleared the airway. Come on, little one. The foal gasped suddenly and shook its head. A thin, shaky breath filled its lungs. Caleb laughed softly in relief. That is a strong one. The newborn struggled to lift its head. Lantern light revealed its coat, chestnut. A white streak ran down its face like a crooked lightning bolt. Wade stared at it. Born in the middle of a blizzard, he whispered, seems fitting. Amos checked the mare carefully. Both are fine. The tension in the barn slowly faded. Some of the horses began eating again. Others lowered their heads and rested. For the first time since the storm began, Caleb felt the fear leave his chest. But outside, the blizzard had not weakened. The storm pounded across the prairie all night. Above the buried barn, the wind screamed and tore at the frozen ground. Snow drifted across the hill in waves, piling deeper with every hour. Inside the hill, time moved slowly. The lanterns burned low. Men dozed sitting against the walls. The horses slept standing in the warm dark. The thermometer stayed steady, 65 degrees. Just before dawn, the storm reached its worst fury. The ground trembled once as a powerful gust slammed into the hill. Dust fell from the roof beams. Wade looked upward nervously. The roof safe. Amos rested a hand against the dirt wall. 3 feet of earth above us and steel beneath it, he said. Snow is nothing compared to soil. The storm can scream all it wants. The hill will hold. And it did. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. Snow buried roads and snapped power lines across the county. Several barns collapsed under the weight of the drifting snow. Metal roofs twisted like tin cans beneath the wind. But inside the hill barn, the temperature never dropped below 60. The ventilation pipes kept the air moving. The herd stayed calm. The newborn foal learned to stand on shaking legs beside its mother. When the storm finally ended on the 3rd morning, the world outside looked completely different. Snow covered the prairie in deep white hills. The sky turned blue again. Caleb unlatched the heavy door and pushed it open. Sunlight spilled down the entrance tunnel. Behind him, 52 horses snorted and shifted, ready to step out. The storm had tried to bury them. but the earth had protected them. And now, the town of Dry Creek was about to see what the old rancher in the hill had built. When the steel door finally opened, sunlight poured into the tunnel like water. For 3 days, the underground barn had known only lantern light and the soft glow of a battery lamp. Now the bright winter sun cut through the entrance and spilled across the dirt floor, lighting the packed herd of horses inside the hill. Caleb stepped outside first. The cold hit him hard, but the wind had finally died. What he saw made him stop. The ranch yard no longer looked like the same place. Snow drifts rose taller than the fences. The chicken shed was buried to the roofline. The road that led down toward Dry Creek had disappeared completely beneath a long white ridge that stretched across the prairie like a frozen wave. Behind him, the horses began to shift and stamp. They smelled open air. Caleb stepped aside as Midnight Prince pushed forward through the tunnel entrance. The stallion blinked in the sunlight and snorted loudly, steam pouring from his nostrils. One by one, the rest of the herd followed. First Amos's 12 horses, then Wade Gannon's entire line. 52 animals stepped out into the morning, alive. Wade walked beside them slowly, his face quiet and stunned. 3 days earlier, he had believed his expensive metal stable was the finest barn in the county. Now it lay somewhere out on his ranch, crushed under snow. He looked back at the hill behind Amos's house. From the outside, the underground barn barely showed itself. A simple timber doorway cut into the slope. A row of vent pipes sticking from the snow like short metal chimneys. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, just a barn built into the earth. The newborn foal stumbled out beside her mother, legs shaky but determined. The chestnut coat shone bright in the sunlight, and the white lightning-shaped stripe on her face made her easy to spot among the herd. Leo leaned against the barn door frame watching them. His face was pale, but he was standing on his own feet again. "Never thought I would be happy to smell horses this much," he said weakly. Amos chuckled quietly. "That smell means work, and work means life." Down the hill, the rumble of an engine drifted across the snow. Caleb turned toward the sound. A county snowplow crawled slowly up the road, pushing a wall of snow ahead of its blade. Behind it came a sheriff's truck and 2 ranch pickups following the cleared path. When the vehicles reached the Mercer property, they stopped. 3 deputies climbed out first. Behind them came a handful of local ranchers. Every man there had heard the radio calls during the storm. Every man expected to find disaster. Instead, they saw 52 horses walking calmly across the yard. Sheriff Nolan stared at the herd in disbelief. "Good Lord," he said. "We thought you lost everything out here." Wade stepped forward before Amos could answer. "Not a single one," he said quietly. The sheriff looked from the herd to the hillside barn. "You kept them in that hole." Amos shrugged. "Kept them where the wind could not reach them." One of the ranchers pointed toward the north horizon. "Wade, your place." Wade turned slowly. Even from 10 miles away, the damage was obvious. The metal barn roof had collapsed completely. The structure looked like someone had stepped on a soda can and crushed it flat. Wade stared at the distant wreckage for a long moment. If those horses had stayed inside that building. He did not finish the sentence. Everyone knew the rest. The sheriff removed his hat. "That hill barn saved every animal in the valley," he said. Word spread through Dry Creek faster than the snowplow could clear the roads. By afternoon, tracks were stopping along the Mercer fence line. Ranchers walked up the hill to see the underground barn with their own eyes. They studied the thick earth roof, the vent pipes, the reinforced doors. They stepped inside the tunnel and felt the warmth that still lingered from the herd. More than one man stood there quietly for a long time. Caleb heard the same sentence over and over. "I thought Amos had lost his mind." One rancher finally shook his head slowly. "Turns out he just remembered things the rest of us forgot." Wade stayed late that afternoon helping move the horses back toward temporary paddocks near the Mercer ranch. The millionaire rancher who once bragged about aluminum barns now worked in silence beside Amos, stacking hay and repairing fence lines buried under snow. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, Wade walked up the hill toward the barn entrance. Amos stood there watching the horses graze. Wade stopped beside him. "I owe you every animal I own," he said quietly. Amos shook his head. "You owe the hill. I just listened to it." Wade looked across the snow-covered prairie. "I spent a fortune trying to build the best barn in the county." He gestured toward the underground stable. "Turns out the best barn was under the ground the whole time." Amos smiled faintly. The earth keeps its temperature whether the sky behaves or not. That is something men knew once. We just forgot. Wade watched the chestnut foal stumble around her mother in the snow. You got a name for that one yet? Caleb walked up behind them. Stormlight, he said. Wade nodded slowly. Seems right. The little foal kicked once and trotted awkwardly through the snow, chasing a drifting piece of straw. Above them, the hill stood quiet and solid against the fading winter sun. The storm that had nearly destroyed the valley had done something else as well. It had changed how the ranchers of Dry Creek thought about shelter forever. But the real lesson of that blizzard would not fully appear until the following summer, because once the snow melted, the sound of digging began across the valley, and the first man to hire an excavator was Wade Gannon himself. When spring finally returned to the Dry Creek Valley, the land looked different, not because the storm had scarred it. The prairie had already begun to heal. Grass pushed up through the thawing soil. The creek ran high with snowmelt. Fence lines were repaired, roofs rebuilt, and cattle turned back into the fields. What had changed was the sound. Across the valley, engines were digging. At first, it was only one. A week after the snow melted, Caleb heard the low growl of a backhoe from the ridge north of the Mercer ranch. When he rode up the road to see who was working, he found Wade Gannon standing beside a yellow excavator while a trench was carved into the side of his own hillside pasture. The millionaire rancher noticed Caleb and walked over. Thought I would try building the next barn the old way, Wade said. Caleb looked at the trench. It was deep, nearly 12 feet into the hill. Looks familiar, Caleb said. Wade gave a tired smile. After watching 43 horses walk out of that storm alive, I decided I had been wrong about a few things. The metal wreckage of his old barn still lay twisted in a pile across the far field. Insurance men had already inspected it and declared the loss complete. But Wade did not rebuild upward. He rebuilt downward. By the end of that summer, 3 other ranchers in Dry Creek had started digging into their own hillsides. Some copied the Mercer design almost exactly. Others added their own improvements: wider stalls, larger air tunnels, separate feed rooms built into the earth beside the main chamber. Each one kept the same simple principle: use the ground. The soil never forgot its temperature. The sky could change in an hour, but 6 feet underground the land stayed steady. Amos Mercer never claimed he invented the idea. When ranchers came to ask questions, he simply showed them what he had built: the gravel drainage trench beneath the floor, the thick beams that carried the weight of the hill, the intake pipes buried deep in the earth where incoming air warmed naturally before reaching the stalls, the high exhaust vents that let rising heat escape slowly so fresh air kept moving through the barn without any electric fans. No generators, no heaters, no complicated machines, just physics, soil, and patience. Some people called it genius. Amos called it common sense. Late that summer, the county agricultural office sent 2 engineers to study the barn after hearing about the storm. They measured temperatures inside the hill stable during the hottest days of August. While the outside air reached 93 degrees, the underground barn stayed at 58. The engineers wrote a report describing the structure as a naturally stabilized livestock shelter using earth insulation and passive ventilation. But the ranchers of Dry Creek explained it in simpler words. The hill keeps the horses alive. The story of the blizzard traveled farther than the county line. Newspapers in Cheyenne printed a short article about the storm and the underground barn that protected 52 horses while modern barns collapsed around the valley. Within a year, several ranch supply companies began selling blueprints for earth-sheltered livestock shelters based on the same principles Amos had used. Some people built them large, some small, but the idea spread. Amos himself never seemed impressed by the attention. On most mornings, he could still be found sitting on the same wooden bench beside the hill barn entrance, watching the horses move slowly across the pasture. The chestnut filly with the lightning stripe grew quickly. Stormlight became the fastest young horse on the Mercer ranch. By the time she reached 2 years old, she could outrun nearly every gelding in the valley. Wade visited often that year, not as a rival anymore, as a friend. Sometimes the 2 old ranchers sat quietly beside the barn entrance while the horses grazed below. One evening, Wade looked out across the valley where several new hillside barns were being finished. "You know something strange?" Wade said. Amos lifted an eyebrow. "What is that?" All those years I thought progress meant building bigger barns with better machines. He nodded toward the hill behind them. Turns out progress was just remembering what the ground already knew. Amos rubbed a hand across the rough wood of the barn door. The earth has been solving winter problems longer than people have been alive, he said. Sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is listen. 10 years later, when Amos Mercer passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 81, half the ranchers in Dry Creek attended the funeral, not because he had been famous, but because every man there had a barn in a hillside somewhere on his land. A few months after his passing, Wade Gannon placed a small wooden sign beside the Mercer Hill barn entrance. It had only a few words burned into the wood, built by Amos Mercer. The barn that beat the blizzard of 1996. Stormlight, now a full-grown mare, grazed nearby with the rest of the herd. And every winter when the wind screamed across the prairie again, the ranchers of Dry Creek slept easier knowing their barns were buried safely in the hills. Because one stubborn old rancher had once been willing to look foolish long enough to build the only shelter strong enough to survive the storm. And sometimes the ideas that look the strangest at first are the ones that keep everything alive when winter finally arrives.